I will honestly say, I don't remember ever speaking a word to Esther the whole time she was there. I think the same basically goes for John. I mean, we talked.
John Amos.
John Amos. We were never friends. We never talked. I wouldn't have called John. I wouldn't have had his number. We were never friends. We never spoke to each other, only on the set.
I wasn't the most diplomatic guy, like I said, in those days, and they got tired of having their lives threatened over jokes.
At 78, Jimmie Walker tells the truth about John Amos. They never spoke off camera during 3 years together. John Amos was threatening writers over scripts, forcing Norman Lear to act.
Norman got on the phone. He said, "Big John." I said, "Yes, Norman." He said, "I've got some good news and some bad news. What do you want first?" I said, "Hey, it's your dime. You made the call." He said, "Well, the good news is we've been picked up for another season."
That phone call ended John Amos's television career. But his real troubles came decades later when his son was accused of elder abuse, and suspicious circumstances surrounded his death.
We've learned that my father has been the victim of elder and financial exploitation. And pretty much everything that was worth anything that was in his home is gone.
This is what Jimmie Walker knows about John Amos that he's never told before. Jimmie Walker worked with John Amos for 3 years on Good Times, from 1974 to 1976. They played father and son on America's most popular black sitcom. Walker never had John's phone number. They never talked outside of filming their scenes. Walker doesn't remember ever having a single conversation with John off camera during those 3 years. John kept to himself and avoided everyone on the set when the cameras stopped rolling. The show's publicist, Barbara Bugliani, tried to book the Good Times cast on talk shows together. She wanted them to appear on Merv Griffin's show like other successful sitcoms did. Other shows like MASH and Happy Days would bring their entire cast together for promotional appearances. Bugliani couldn't get the Good Times cast to sit in the same room together unless they were being paid to film episodes. The cast would rather lose promotional opportunities than spend time together voluntarily. Walker admits he knew nothing about John's personal life despite working closely with him. He couldn't tell anyone what John did on weekends, where he lived in Los Angeles, or what his interests were outside the show. John arrived at CBS Studio City minutes before filming and left immediately after his scenes were completed. He spent breaks between scenes alone in his dressing room with the door closed. Walker learned to avoid approaching John unless it was absolutely necessary for their scenes.
I could not tell you what Esther did. I could not tell you what John did. I knew nothing about him. I know nothing about him now.
Even decades later, Walker still knows nothing about John's life. They've attended reunion events and fan conventions where they've been forced to interact professionally. John remained distant and uncommunicative even during these brief encounters. The man Walker played son to for 3 years stayed a complete stranger to him. Walker says he knows more about random people he meets in restaurants than he ever knew about John Amos. The silence between cast members affected everyone who worked on Good Times. Guest stars noticed immediately that the supposed family members didn't interact like real family. Directors had to work around the cast's inability to maintain normal relationships. Crew members described the atmosphere as uncomfortable and tense compared to other television productions they had worked on. The emotional distance between the actors was so obvious that it became legendary within the television industry.
John is a great actor, and you saw it, to me, in a lot of things, but West Wing, I think John was monstrous in that. I mean, he did other things, of course. John is a good actor, a solid actor, and I think it was just this show, this situation, that was against anything and everything he believed in.
Walker points out that John's behavior was specific to Good Times. John had worked professionally on The Mary Tyler Moore Show before Good Times without causing problems. Something about the Good Times situation triggered John's worst behavior. He had signed on to the project expecting to portray positive black family values. Instead, the show became focused on JJ's catchphrases and comedic antics. John's frustration with this direction consumed him and made him impossible to work with. John Amos hated the scripts the Good Times writers created for black characters. The writing staff was entirely white and had no understanding of black family dynamics. John believed they were creating stereotypical portrayals that damaged how black families were seen on television. He confronted writers about storylines he found offensive. His complaints escalated beyond normal professional disagreements into what the writers considered genuine threats against their safety. John was particularly angry about the increasing focus on JJ's character and the dynamite catchphrase. He felt this emphasis on silly comedy was destroying the show's potential to address serious issues facing black families in America. John demanded changes to scripts and argued with producers about the show's direction. His approach to these conflicts was so aggressive that people started avoiding him rather than trying to work with his concerns.
The differences I had with the producers of the show was that I felt too much emphasis was being put on JJ and his chicken hat and saying dynamite every third page.
John watched his character, James Evans Sr., become secondary to JJ's antics. The show had originally been conceived as an ensemble piece about a struggling black family. By the third season, it had transformed into a showcase for Walker's comedic performance. John felt this change was turning the show into exactly the kind of minstrel entertainment that damaged black representation in media. His anger over this transformation made him increasingly difficult to work with. Norman Lear faced an impossible situation. Good Times was the #1 rated show on television and generating millions in revenue for CBS. But John's behavior had created such a toxic work environment that writers were afraid to do their jobs. Lear had to choose between keeping his star actor and protecting his writing staff. He decided that no show was worth putting people in fear for their safety.
Norman got on the phone. He said, "Big John." I said, "Yes, Norman." He said, "I've got some good news and some bad news. What do you want first?" I said, "Hey, it's your dime. You made the call." He said, "Well, the good news is we've been picked up for another season." And then he said, "You want the bad news?" I said, "Sure. How bad can it be?" He said, "You won't be with us."
The irony of John's firing was that Good Times had never been more successful. The show was guaranteed renewal and was making everyone involved wealthy. But success couldn't overcome the problems John's behavior had created. Lear was willing to sacrifice the show's lead actor rather than continue dealing with the threats and intimidation. The decision shocked Hollywood because networks don't usually fire stars from hit shows. John Amos's pattern of conflict and control didn't end when Norman Lear fired him from Good Times. Decades later, the same issues would surface in his relationship with his own children. In May 2023, John's daughter Shannon made shocking public accusations about elder abuse and financial exploitation. She claimed her 83-year-old father was being victimized by people who were supposed to care for him. Shannon's story began when John called her from a Memphis hospital in May 2023. He was asking for help and sounded distressed. Shannon was out of the country at the time, but arranged for a family member to check on him immediately. She flew to Memphis as quickly as possible and found John in the ICU. According to Shannon, she discovered that everything valuable had been stolen from John's Colorado home while he was traveling. Shannon claimed that John had been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia in 2016, making him vulnerable to exploitation. She accused caregivers of isolating John from family members and stealing his possessions. The accusation suggested that John had become completely dependent on people who were using his declining mental capacity to control his finances and living situation.
We've learned that my father has been the victim of elder abuse and financial exploitation. And pretty much everything that was worth anything that was in his home is gone.
Shannon's public plea for help painted a picture of an elderly man who had been completely victimized. She described having to work with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and local sheriff's departments to pursue criminal charges. Shannon launched a GoFundMe campaign to pay for John's medical care and legal fees. She said John would need extensive rehabilitation and a safe place to live when he was released from the hospital. The family dysfunction became public when Shannon used social media to expose what she claimed was happening to her father. She described John as one of the most generous people she knew, someone who would give anyone the shirt off his back. The idea that people had stolen from him and left him in terrible conditions devastated Shannon and motivated her to fight for justice.
I can only say they were caregivers or a caregiver. And that's about all I can say about that right now. My dad is going to need extensive medical care and rehabilitation. We're going to have to relocate him into a safe space with long-term care.
Shannon couldn't reveal many details about the alleged perpetrators because criminal investigations were ongoing. She could only say that they were caregivers who had been entrusted with John's care. The carefully worded statement suggested that John's most trusted associates had turned against him. The people who were supposed to protect him from exploitation had become the primary source of his victimization. John's son, K.C. Amos, immediately fought back against Shannon's accusations. He used social media to deny her claims and contradicted her version of events about their father's condition. The public dispute between siblings exposed deep family fractures that had been building for years. K.C. claimed that Shannon's GoFundMe campaign was unauthorized and that John was perfectly fine. The family war exploded into public view when K.C. posted on social media that the fundraising effort was not approved by John. He directly contradicted Shannon's claims that she was acting in their father's best interests. The siblings were using social platforms to wage war over their father's care and finances. Their public dispute created confusion about John's actual condition and needs. John's representatives issued official denials of Shannon's elder abuse allegations. They claimed that John's hospitalization was due to fluid buildup in his body, not or neglect. The statement suggested that Shannon's accusations were completely false and that John was receiving proper care. This created a he said, she said situation that made it impossible for outsiders to determine the truth. John was speaking through representatives rather than addressing his daughter's concerns directly. The fact that he wasn't communicating with Shannon personally showed how completely the family had broken down. John's publicist, Belinda Foster, became his primary spokesperson and controlled access to him. This arrangement made it difficult for family members to verify John's actual condition or wishes. The dispute escalated when K.C. posted responses telling his social media followers that John was doing well. He contradicted every aspect of Shannon's elder allegations and portrayed her as someone who was creating drama for attention. The public nature of their fight damaged John's privacy and reputation, while the siblings battled for control over his narrative. K.C.'s blunt social media statement ended with just the word "period" to emphasize his finality on the subject. He wasn't interested in debating the issue or explaining his position in detail. The brevity of his response suggested complete dismissal of Shannon's concerns. This communication style mirrored the same isolation tactics that John had used on the Good Times set when he avoided engaging with people directly. John Amos died on August 21, 2024, from congestive heart failure. His son, K.C., didn't announce the death until October 1, 2024, more than a month later. By the time anyone else knew John was dead, his body had already been cremated. Shannon and other family members learned about John's death through media reports, not from K.C. directly. The delayed announcement and immediate cremation raised serious questions about what had happened in John's final weeks. The cremation took place just 9 days after John's death on August 21st. K.C. arranged for the cremation without informing other family members that John had died. He kept John's ashes at his own home while telling nobody about his father's passing. The rushed cremation eliminated any possibility of an autopsy that might have revealed whether neglect or abuse contributed to John's death. Shannon discovered that she had learned about her father's death the same way millions of strangers did, through entertainment news reports. KC had made a public announcement without calling his sister or other family members first. This revelation showed how completely KC had isolated John from other relatives in his final months. The same isolation tactics that John had used on good times were now being used to control his own death.
He died on August 21st, yet he was announcing it on October 1st. And what happened? Everyone is wondering how in the world
how did that
John Amos
happen?
is dead for that long.
So John Amos's daughter Shannon said she found out when her brother told the media.
The timeline raised immediate suspicions about why KC had kept his father's death secret for over a month. Shannon had been publicly fighting for John's welfare just months earlier, claiming he was being and exploited. Now she was discovering that her father had been dead for weeks while she believed he was still alive and in need of protection. The delayed announcement suggested that KC wanted to prevent any investigation into the circumstances of John's death. KC kept John's ashes at his home while maintaining complete silence about the death. He had gained total control over his father's remains and could control the narrative about how John had died. The immediate cremation meant that no independent medical examination could determine whether the elder allegations Shannon had made might have contributed to John's deteriorating health.
John was cremated 9 days after he died back in August.
Kelly Amos,
more than a month ago.
The son, yeah.
And he, by the way, he died of congested heart failure. But he cremated him almost immediately. He has the ashes at his home.
That KC, the son, has the ashes.
The rushed cremation became the most suspicious aspect of John's death. Congestive heart failure can be related to poor medical care or neglect of underlying health conditions. By destroying John's body before anyone else knew he was dead, KC had eliminated any possibility of determining whether the elder Shannon had described might have contributed to his father's death. The immediate cremation looked like an attempt to cover up evidence. The most shocking revelation about John's death came when Shannon discovered that someone had impersonated her in the hospital emergency room on the night her father died. Someone named Belinda Foster had convinced hospital staff that she was John's daughter, giving her control over his medical decisions and access to information about his condition. This deception meant that John died alone, cut off from his real family even in his final moments. Belinda Foster was serving as both John's caregiver and his publicist, giving her complete control over his physical care and public image. She had been the person issuing denials of Shannon's elder allegations on John's behalf. Now Shannon discovered that Foster had posed as his daughter during his final hospitalization. This revealed the sophisticated nature of the alleged scheme to keep John isolated from his real family. Shannon learned that Foster had been presenting herself as John's daughter to medical professionals, which allowed her to make decisions about his care without input from his actual children. The hospital staff had no reason to doubt Foster's identity and gave her the access and authority that should have belonged to John's real family. This deception ensured that Shannon and other relatives were kept away from John, even as he was dying.
Said, someone was in the ER the night my father died and pretended to be his daughter. I'm his only daughter. We believe it was Belinda Foster, the woman who's also posing as his publicist. He died alone without family.
The impostor scandal showed how completely John had been isolated from his real family in his final years. The same man who had isolated himself from his Good Times co-stars ended his life surrounded by people who allegedly saw him only as a source of money and control. Foster's dual role as caregiver and publicist meant she could control both John's daily life and his public image while keeping his real family away from him. Shannon hired attorney James H. Davis III to investigate the circumstances surrounding her father's death and the events leading up to it. The investigation focused on whether John had received proper medical care and whether his death could have been prevented. Shannon's legal team filed petitions accusing KC, Foster, and associate Eugene Brummett of elder abuse, fraud, and wrongful death. The legal battle over John's estate revealed how completely KC had gained control over his father's finances. In 2020, KC had filed documents giving him sole ownership of John's production company, Step and 1/2 Productions. This gave him control over money flowing from John's residuals and licensing deals. Shannon's lawsuit claimed that KC had manipulated John into signing legal documents that essentially disinherited other family members. The elder abuse scandal that consumed John's final years connected directly back to the behavior patterns Jimmie Walker had witnessed on Good Times. The same man who couldn't form genuine relationships with his television family ended his life isolated from his real family. Walker's confession about never speaking to John off camera suddenly seemed prophetic when viewed alongside John's death, surrounded by alleged exploiters rather than people who loved him. John Amos died on August 21, 2024, alone in a Memphis hospital while an impostor posed as his daughter. The man who had once threatened Good Times writers became a victim of people who used deception and control to exploit his declining health. Walker's admission that he knew nothing about John's personal life despite working with him for 3 years proved accurate. John remained a mystery even to his own family until the very end. Anyway, that's it for the video, folks. Bye.